Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor. I'm honored to be here with Zeppelin and with Berk. I've been following Zeppelin and Berk for a long time, and I think this is the first time we've really crossed paths. And so
Yeah,
it's fun to be here together. Yeah, so UX Tools is a hub of resources for product designers and UX designers that I've been running with my partner Jordan for 6 or 7 years now. And we've put out many resources over the years. We have a design tools database that tracks different tools and their capabilities. We run an annual design tool survey. And for the first time this year, we ran a survey about design delivery, trying to better understand industry best practices and behaviors on design teams. And so we surveyed 75 design teams and interviewed a few different folks to learn more about that. And so excited to break into that today.
cool. Yeah. And let me do like a quick intro as well. Hey, everybody, I'm Berk. I'm one of the co-founders of Zeppelin. Gosh, it's been a while now since we started. It's been almost 7, 8 years now. And it's going to be really exciting to talk about design delivery today because it's a topic that we've been really focusing on in the past few years really heavily. And in fact, actually, that's actually where I can start. So just talk a little bit about like what is even design delivery.
Yeah, let's do it.
Um, yeah, so I guess if you were around 7, 8 years ago when we first started, the challenge that we were really trying to solve back in the day was how do you sort of get to specs from a design file? Back then, sort of Sketch was the thing. So you would sort of put in the Sketch file and Zeppelin would give you the specs. And over the years, we've been working with thousands of teams and sort of trying to figure out like what sort of makes them more efficient and sort of just sort of a happier team overall. So we kind of realized there are a lot of common patterns that a lot of these teams use, and it's way beyond just sharing some red lines or specs. And this stage of work we kind of call design delivery, and it's all about sort of providing not just developers but sort of the broader team about basically everything they need in order to turn the product into reality. So yeah, I mean, we'll talk about a lot of these things during the session, but there's a lot of sort of nuances in terms of like how you share your work and sort of what additional context you need to share. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about design delivery.
I remember when I was just a wee little junior UX designer starting out 7 or 8 years ago when you mentioned, and I remember, I think I was using the Sketch Measure plugin at the time, and I
Yeah,
had to
yeah.
like, I knew all these like shortcuts and was redlining everything. And then Zeppelin came out and it just felt like the future, right? And the whole team was like, oh my God, like Zeppelin will do this for you, and it felt like this crazy thing. And now we take a lot of that for granted, right? We push forward and
Yeah.
we've moved past a lot of that. And I think that's kind of what exists in our heads a lot of times when people say like design handoff, but it's not that simple as you mentioned. There's a lot more to successfully getting a good design and user experience into a customer's hands, getting that
Mhm.
from all the way from concept to production. There's a lot that goes on there, and I'm checking my notes here, but I think 90% of our respondents said that like when that design gets implemented, there's at least something that doesn't match, right? Which is almost
Yes.
everybody. And so here we are 7 or 8 years later, but we're still figuring this out, right? Nothing is perfect, and there are
Mhm.
still things to improve. And I think another thing that this kind of uncovered, or rather maybe kind of affirmed for us, was that it's more than just designers and developers, right? We'll break into this a little bit down the road, but it's not just I'm a designer, I designed the thing, now you as a developer implement it. But we've got some other stakeholders also kind of peeking in on
Yes.
designs. We've got different people who are informed or participating. So there's a lot to chat about here, and I'm excited to do that.
Yeah, for sure. When we actually first started, I think our sort of first tagline was collaboration app for designers and developers or something like that. And then over the years, we've realized there's actually a lot of different people using Zeppelin throughout the day, a lot of PMs, QA folks, copywriters, a lot of just different sort of stakeholders who need that sort of design source of truth to come in and just start doing their work. So a lot of this design delivery stuff we talked about, yeah, it is way beyond just designers and developers. It's kind of providing a yeah, like a source of truth for everyone, where you can sort of get to all the resources that you need in one place, basically.
Yeah. And that's exciting to be able to chat with you about this, because Zeplin has such a deep wealth of knowledge about this topic as well. And so pairing the survey, I think, together is going to be fun, kind of breaking into this.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have a kind of a unique way of looking at this. So I'm happy to dive into that.
Cool. Well, let me give kind of a brief overview of the survey and what some of the data looks like. We surveyed 75 design teams, and then we did 5 qualitative interviews with some of those respondents. And there were some really obvious things, and there were some also new insights that came out of that. Some common trends that we saw that almost everybody does. So if you're listening, you probably do this on your team. A lot of designers or respondents are separating their work in different places. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means, like in progress versus final. They are also working with PMs in addition to developers, PM being product manager in this context. So that's almost universal, that if you're a product or UX designer, you're probably working with a product manager. And then there's a few areas that are more complicated or where things weren't so clear. And those are marking work ready for development and how you kind of let developers know what's ready to go versus what's not. Version control, that we'll talk a little bit more about, how designers organize their files, and then everybody's favorite topic, design systems. And so we can kind of break each of those down and talk a little bit more. But Berk, any comments or ideas from you before we jump in?
No, I don't think so. I'm just yeah, I'm ready to go.
All right. We're also going to look at some of this data as well. So let me make sure I've got everything set up here. The first topic that we'll cover is the idea of marking work ready for development and how designers do that. And I think we saw a little bit of movement on this last week. Figma announced a new feature where I think it's with their sections now within your pages, you can mark something as ready for development. And it's mostly just that kind of a toggle. Is this ready for development? Yes or no. This survey was run before that was out, so I don't have any data that says if that is successful or if people are using that or how that works. But so clearly people are thinking about this. This is a common problem. I'm sure Figma has picked up on a lot of the same data that we're kind of looking at now.
Yeah, what's really interesting here is that back in the day, kind of this design tools being offline, or you're sort of working in Sketch, let's say, as a local file. Now every tool is different though, but so you kind of inherently did this thing where you would either export some PNGs or create some like a fancy PDF document that has all your designs. And that would kind of naturally separate your sort of work in progress and this snapshot that you take of your designs and then you share with people. There's obviously a lot of downsides to that as well, because if you're actively sort of iterating on a design, it's really great to be able to just see the live version all the time. So I think that's, Figma coming in and providing that sort of always live collaborative space was amazing in that sense. But when things start to get real, and let's say you've done all your iterations, everyone's kind of in there collaborating, and then you finally make the call and be like, okay, we're ready to build this thing. Then I think that sort of collaboration shape changes a little bit. We're calling that more like an async collaboration, where that commitment is made, and then the developer just needs a snapshot of the design to get to start working from. At that point, you don't want to just give them your live design link, because that's just going to be really confusing. So a lot of people, what we realize is in Figma, but we can sort of look into the data as well, they need some way of like separating the work that they're like currently working on versus that snapshot that's been shared with the team.
Yeah, that's a good point to think about. there's like different dimensions we can look at, such as the team and their behaviors and practices, but also the tools and the natural affordances that those tools have, right? And so
Mhm.
a live collaboration unlimited canvas tool like Figma affords a certain style of collaboration.
Mhm.
And likely because we know most designers right now are using Figma, most of our community and respondents are using Figma, that likely biases some of the results that we see because they're having to engage with a tool that has those affordances, right? So
Yeah.
let's check out some data and kind of see what people were saying about this topic. So how do respondents organize in-progress designs from finalized designs that are ready to be built? This one's pretty obvious. There's a big purple bar there at the top. But just breaking down each of these responses, respondents could either say that they kept them in separate files, projects, or pages. They kept them in separate tools. They kept them in separate areas of the same canvas, or they didn't keep them separate at all, or a small other option there. And kind of overwhelmingly, people are using files, projects, or pages to kind of split things within the same tool. But it is interesting to note that there is a separation occurring, right? Very few respondents here are actually not keeping them separate and just kind of lumping everything together. So there is a need to separate things, as you said, Berk. Previously, there was a natural split because you probably had to export in some way, and
Mhm.
that created the
Mhm.
division. That need still exists to separate work, but there's kind of a few different ways that people are doing that here. I think there's also I mentioned this a little bit, but this might also differ based on teams, right? If you're a really small, like I'm at a really small startup right now, and I don't need to have a lot of rigid
Mhm.
structure and separation of work. I'd probably do something pretty light, like a
Mhm.
section or a
Mhm.
page or something like that. But depending on your team, if you're at a really large enterprise or you're working with external clients or whatever that might be, you might have processes in place that require you to be more structured in your approach to that. So there's a few different variables that I think might impact this data, but any other kind of insights you're seeing here, Berk?
Yeah, for sure. It really depends on, I think, sort of uh, I guess maybe sort of the almost like the nimbleness of the team, where you might have just a few people working in the same office, just sitting next to each other. You might not really need that separation, but as the team gets bigger and bigger, there's kind of a need to be uh, more purposeful, I guess, about that. Just being really clear about which designs are ready to be built versus which is still in progress. We've talked to a lot of people not using Zeppelin as well, and the most common sort of theme that I saw was sort of that big purple bar as well, where a lot of people, I think before the config announcement, this is kind of what Figma recommended people to do as well, is to almost have a separate page that people usually call like a handoff page, where designs get moved over whenever they're ready, and that's kind of like the theme that most what that we hear from most teams. But what's also interesting is that the announcement that Figma made last week, like you said, they have a brand new feature where you can select a group of screens, pull them into a section, and then mark it as a ready for dev. I think it's great for that Figma is kind of really understanding this pain point and coming up with a native solution to this, rather than just kind of a workaround. So I'm really curious how this is going to change, because if you look at the chart, I guess only like 15% ish of folks are sort of using the same canvas and then marking, yeah, the a separate area within the same canvas. I feel like
Show here.
that's really gonna help those folks. I don't know how the sort of the big purple bar is going to sort of start adopting this feature. It's going to be really interesting to sort of do a similar survey, maybe in like 6 months, and see how this changed.
Yeah. Yep. And it's so hard to keep up with how quickly tools change. And I think tools play such a big role in these behaviors. So definitely a
Yeah,
need for a follow-up here to kind of see how things change.
yeah. It's honestly, like I said, kind of in the beginning, we have kind of a unique perspective here, where we believe kind of in a more structured approach. We take a lot of inspiration from how developers use Git. I mean, we'll talk about versioning in a bit as well. Kind of a similar story where we want people to be able to have kind of a native solution where all of this process is done through like a set workflow where just to talk about how we try to solve this in Zeplin, you simply select a few designs that are ready for dev, you export them out to Zeplin, and that's where your sort of final designs are kept. And the designs there are locked. There's once you sort of made that commitment, the designs are just going to be locked in Zeplin. What's really nice about this is that there's no confusion around, oh, I missed, like the designer made a small change and I missed that. So it's kind of similar to, like I said, to how developers work. If you commit something and then you realize, oh, wait, I missed this thing, you just need to do another commit, because that's how things work. It's kind of a structured way of sharing your work. And that's kind of how we're approaching this whole problem as well. I'm going to touch on this probably a few times during this talk, but I believe there's really value in being more structured as you're thinking about these challenges. Sure, any design tool is flexible enough to solve these challenges, but there's value in having a set workflow that everyone in your company follows.
Yeah, and I think we'll look into some of that standardization here in a little bit as well. You brought up version control. Let's see, we've got some data to check on that as well. So how often do developers miss changes to an existing design? So this would be someone who is probably a designer who has created something, who has already collaborated with the dev team, and development has likely started, and then or maybe is already built, right? And then a designer needs to come in and tweak something small or make a small update for whatever reason that might be. And then does the developer catch that or notice that small change? Does that actually make it into the product, and is that finalized? And we've got a big bar here in the middle. But if you consider kind of adding up, I think these two bars here, right, of people experiencing the need to fix those changes that are missed, that's about 85% of designers saying that those things go unnoticed, right? So this kind of comes back to what we were saying, that like this, though this has become easier, this is not a solved problem yet, right? Like we're not getting pixel perfect designs into products every time. This is not a small issue. It continues to be a very common thread, and something that designers commonly bump up against, or developers as well, right, as they're kind of trying to follow along. So diagnosing kind of the root cause of this, or what might be causing this, I think it could be a number of things. Again, it depends a lot on the team, but it seems like if you had already broken ground on development, or something had already been built, and a designer is now coming back into Figma or whatever tool to change that, there has to be a mechanism to let the development team know that the new change needs to be built, right? And I would assume that that's probably happening in some other channel. So that might be Slack or Jira, or I don't know, wherever they're tracking their work. And whether or not that's happening, it feels like there's probably a communication breakdown happening somewhere, where links are being sent out, and I don't know, somebody's probably trying to highlight some change that was made. But clearly whatever's happening isn't super successful, as we're seeing here. And it's not just an easy fix to send that out. But what are you noticing about this, Berk?
Yeah, whenever we ask designers, like, hey, how do you make sure developers sort of don't miss the changes that you've made? And this usually happens, like you said, whenever you've already shared your designs as sort of ready for dev, but you're still noticing some things that need improvement, which is totally normal. That always happens. So how do you make sure that doesn't go unnoticed? And the answer is usually just Slack. People are like, hey, I made some changes. You want to make sure that you don't miss them. And that's kind of like, again, not a very structured way of solving this this problem, but it kind of gets the job done. So as we were thinking a lot about this challenge over the years, we were kind of again thinking like, can we find a sort of a better solution where these types of changes happen, as these types of changes happen, everyone in the team is aware. And again, the solution sort of came from us as developers, like how do we solve this challenge? It's very common for a developer to be able to, like, let's say you're working in your IDE, you make some changes to your code, and those changes, whenever you want to share them with the rest of your team, you have to go through this process of like, you stage your changes and then you commit them, and you're also like required to provide a commit message as well, and then everyone in the team is aware of like what you've changed and why you've changed it. So this is obviously kind of a very strict process. So we were thinking, how can we sort of make this easier and more sort of fit for the designer's workflow? So it really builds upon what I just talked about in this sort of that separation section. The first step is to sort of put your designs into Zeplin, and that's how you're indicating to your team that it's sort of ready for development. And then let's say you made a couple more iterations. That's when you sort of publish the design again to Zeplin, and that becomes a sort of a new version. And all the changes that you make over time are kept in a log. And a lot of people also ask me, like, how's that different than like versions in Figma? And I think the key difference is just you being really intentional about, about those versions. The versioning that Figma has, I think, again, is amazing as you're like iterating, because you don't have to think about it. You just try different things, and Figma keeps track of all the changes you make. But whenever it's time to build, we believe that you need a more structured solution. And that's where all the sort of versioning systems come in. So we believe just the solution here is just being really, like I said, sort of intentional about the changes you make and communicating them in a structured way. I've seen people do this in Figma as well, by the way. You don't have to do this in Zeplin. The solution is to almost like how you have your separate handoff pages. You could create like duplicate pages where you have your different versions. I've seen a lot of teams do this where they have 5 different versions of the handoff page, and it just evolves over time. So it is possible to solve all of these things, because these tools are really flexible. But what I believe is going to be sort of the solution is for us to come up with a Git-like solution for design, essentially.
Yeah, as you were talking, I also thought about some of the different behaviors I've seen from designers. You brought up the word kind of being intentional and intentionality, and I think some of that can honestly be a signal of design maturity. I've seen some younger designers who maybe haven't collaborated a lot with developers or haven't experienced that pain of something being built and then having to change it, and will just kind of continuously be in the file messing with things, and even just moving things around or swapping the order of things, and all of that has a cost. And so understanding like the trickle down effects of those small changes, right, and what that means. And so it's not just about organizing and communication, but it's also like respect for the craft and for the cost. Exactly. And for the with what you're incurring. And so I think also you'll see maybe some battle scarred designers who've been through the gauntlet a little bit, and they understand like that small change maybe doesn't matter, and I'm not gonna start this whole process of opening a new ticket. Some developers gonna have to make this, and I'm gonna get a pull request, and I'm gonna prove it, blah blah blah. Like, but instead they're gonna say that small change isn't worth it. I'm gonna, I have bigger fish to fry. I'm gonna come take care of this, and so lots of different factors can play into that, and it really depends on what the team needs. And maybe a small change is very important, and that's up to the team to figure out. But you're right. I like that idea of that intentionality with the team and how they make those decisions.
Yeah, regardless of the tool you use, that's kind of the thing you need.
Yeah, right on. Let's see. So something interesting, let's jump forward a little bit here, is this idea of file organization. We asked a few questions about this. And let's take a look at some data. One of the questions we asked was if teams have a standardized way to organize designs for developers to understand. And so that could be within a file. It could be that there's some export process, or there's some another third-party tool that they're pushing into, or whatever that means. But we have kind of an interesting breakdown here where respondents could either say that yes, they have a standard organization and people do it, or yes, we have a standard organization and nobody does it, or we don't have a standard organization at all. We're pretty evenly split here between having and not having organization. And then for those teams who do have some sort of standardized organization, compliance is not very good. About half of those people follow it. So this is a pretty interesting one to dig into, because there's just not a clear win here. There's not kind of clear-cut answers in this data. So it seems like maybe designers and teams are pretty mixed on if this should be done, or how it should be done, or if it's worth doing, right, is what it seems like to me. I have some other thoughts, but any early thoughts from you, Berk?
Yeah, I think sort of like the key thing here is like a lot of people, like most of us, are organized, as you know, as you're working in your file. But the key thing here is that standardization. And I've talked to a bunch of teams where every individual designer in the team, they do their best to make sure that their file is organized as possible. Whatever they're handing off to the developers is as organized as possible. But the crucial thing there is everyone's kind of doing it in their own way. And every time they do it, they try to improve it. They try to get better at it. And there's usually, I mean, I guess if we look at this chart, like 35% of teams don't have a way that they've decided on how they should do this. So it's kind of up to the designer to come up with their own solution. And it's also kind of up to the designer as well. Some designers really care about this type of process, and they spend so much time making sure their files are super neatly organized. And then some designers are just, oh, here's my Figma link, just go look at it. So it's kind of like there's kind of a mix of that too here. But it's kind of the trick here is if you want sort of harmony across the entire product team, the end goal here is to have a very structured way of kind of organizing your designs when things are ready to be built. So you kind of always follow the same pattern, and all the developers and sort of the broader team, whenever they look at a design, they don't have to figure out how it's organized and where they should be looking at. And it's always kind of following that same pattern.
You know, as I think about this, there's a lot of similarities between this and like a design system, where a design system is more visual and about building, but design system is all about repeatable, scalable patterns, right? And so what we're talking about here is more of an organization and communication system. But imagine that, you know, you work with several different teams or pods where designers and developers are switching teams, or new folks are being hired, or whatever that cost of transition is. It's lowered when everybody's operating on the same principles and information, right? So if you can get into anyone else's file or anyone else's design and know where things are, and know how things are annotated, and know where the assets are you need to export, and et cetera, it pays down a lot of that cost. And I do think there's a little bit of a, maybe not design maturity, but also kind of team cohesion element here, that how long that team has worked together. They might have ways that they like to do things, or ways that they look for things, and finding ways to sort of encode that into the system can help, can greatly benefit the team. But clearly this is a bit of an uphill battle, because there's a lot of work to do here based on what we're seeing with the data.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of sad to see, but I've even talked to teams with like tens and hundreds of designers, and without this lack of organization, it kind of falls to the shoulders of the individual designer to sort of come up with their own solution. And it's not just that they are, working on these designs. They have to just, they have this sort of mental work that they need to do in order to make sure, like, every time they share their designs, like, how do I share this thing the best? Let me make sure I'm like neatly organized so my developers are, more efficient. So it's kind of, yeah, there's a lot of challenges that the individual designer has to sort of take on. But that could have been solved as kind of a standardization across the company. Yeah, this is a topic that we've been thinking a lot about at Zeplin as well. The sort of the nature of the infinite canvas is, I believe, perfect for designers. That's where the creative work should happen. But again, when you think about whenever you're sort of getting a snapshot of your designs and things are ready to be built, why don't we sort of start using a more structured way of like presenting the designs? So naturally, whenever you move things over to Zeplin, things are organized in like a simple grid format. The reason why we sort of went with that in the first place is that I think one of the key things is that it's really easily searchable and filterable. You can't really do that in the infinite canvas. It just doesn't naturally fit that workflow. So that's kind of what we started with back in the day. And over the years, we've added a bunch of little organizational capabilities on top of that. So you can sort of visually group things using sections. We have tags where you can mark things as, maybe something's blocked and you want to get some review from the copywriter. You can tag things with different purposes. And again, this is really helpful whenever someone comes into the project. They can just filter to the thing they need. And finally, the one I'm like most excited about is, I think one of the downsides of the canvas is usually one screen is represented by like 5 or 6 screens because it has a bunch of different states. And that's, I think, really complicates that sort of, whenever I'm looking at a canvas of a designer, those different variants of the same screen is the thing that sort of really complicates that visual layout of the designs. So we were also thinking about like, how do we actually solve this challenge? So we came up with a feature we call screen variants. So all of the variants of a screen sort of get combined into one. So you can, as you're looking at a design, you sort of quickly toggle between the loading state or the error state or dark mode, light mode, sort of whatever kind of, it's up to you. But these are the things that we're really thinking about at Zeplin. Like, how do we come up with these native ways of organizing? So whenever a designer is in Zeplin, they move their designs over, they have a set of capabilities they can use. And at the end of the day, everyone in the product team gets the same sort of experience.
I was thinking about the infinite canvas, and I think we as designers sort of get blind to how chaotic some of those files can become and some of those designs can become, especially if it's your own design. You know where everything is. You know exactly how it's annotated and structured. But like, have you ever stepped into someone else's like Miro or FigJam document, like where it's just like Rain Man in there, and there's just like lines and sticky notes everywhere, and you jump into that and you go, what the hell am I looking at, right? Like, where do I start? What am I even reading here? And I imagine that's probably what it feels like for especially non-designers jumping into our design files, potentially even other designers as well. Maybe even you jumping into your old design file from 6 months ago that you forgot about. But like, so imagine like you can move in 4 directions. There could be content absolutely anywhere. There's some stuff that's so small you got to zoom in, and some stuff that's so big you got to zoom out. And like there's just a lot to traverse there. And now imagine that you're like, maybe like you're an executive who's trying to understand something, right? And you're coming in and looking at one of these, or you're a product marketer, or you're someone who's not closely involved with the design, but you rely on the information in that design to make decisions. That could be a pretty huge mess. So So I think I think you're right. Infinite canvas is a brilliant way to design and explore and iterate. It is not a brilliant way to communicate and showcase. And so more structured, rigid ways of presenting, like grids, tried and true patterns like grids, make it simpler for people to consume some of that. So yeah, wholeheartedly agree. And I mean, even depending on what platform you're on, right? Some people have difficulty scrolling horizontally depending on the form factor of their mouse, right? So even getting around the infinite canvas. Anyway, I could go on, but I won't. Let's shift gears a little bit. Just checking the time here, and let's talk about design systems. Everybody loves to talk about design systems, right? We love to make them, we love to break them, we love to detach from symbol, whatever you got to do. Design systems are all the hotness right now. And we learned some interesting things about how people use them and how successful design systems are. Let's look at a couple questions we asked here. So first off, how often do developers use the correct design system elements in the product? By the way, if you're unfamiliar with what the term design system means, it's essentially a collection of patterns that can be reused both in design and code, such as a button, a text input, that sort of thing. So how often do developers use the correct design system elements in the product? Often. This is pretty good. It's a pretty good rate, but we've definitely got some stragglers down here who have a little bit of trouble. And then what portion of components in your component library match the components in your code base? And we've got a really big chunk of some components, which is kind of everybody sitting there in the middle. Good job to these folks who have all or nearly all their components matched. That's a great, good, healthy design system. But essentially, like half of the teams surveyed say that developers are often using the correct design system element. And at the same time, about 1/3 of those teams have a one-to-one correspondence between their component library and kind of the components and the code base. So we're seeing pretty decent behavior here. But something that I picked up on pretty quickly from my own experience and also from some of the interviews I did with some of these folks is that designers very quickly become kind of the intersection of component health, if you will, like knowing, oh yeah, that is an official component, but also it's out of date as of 2 months ago because my teammate Jane changed it and that team hasn't finished rolling it out. Oh, and also this one has been refactored to some new language we're using, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what can happen is a lot of tribal knowledge can build up where designers know more than what is visible, say, on the canvas or in the code. And designers kind of act as a liaison between, the visual side of that and the developers who are building the code side of that. And so that can have a high cost to it as well, because it's hard for a team to peer in and see what the actual state of the design system is. So overall, I think we're seeing pretty good patterns here in design systems, but clearly it's not easy to keep all that updated or keep everyone informed with what we're seeing here. But what have you seen, Berk?
Yeah, it's even if you have a really mature design system team, I think one of the challenges is all of the documentation that happens around components, tokens, and stuff like that kind of happens kind of in a siloed environment. Maybe I can sort of talk through an example. Let's imagine a developer working on a sort of a day-to-day project. They have a screen that they need to build, and they're looking at the design. It's kind of up to them to be able to identify what components make up that design. So you have this documentation that lives somewhere else. Everybody sort of goes and reads through that whenever they're onboarding, and that's natural. And but that thing constantly evolves. So it's kind of up to you to make sure that you're really familiar with all the components in there. And so that's why, like, as you're building a design, you're not recreating something from scratch. So that's a really common theme that a challenge that we've seen to some of the teams that we've talked to. Like, how do we make sure that whenever someone's looking at a design, they can immediately tell oh, look, these are the different components and tokens that make up this design. And this is only the first half of it. And then the second half of it is, okay, I know which components my designer has used, but do these components exist in my code base? And like, do I even know which one it is? So we were really thinking about like, how do you tackle this challenge? And a lot of designers who try to solve this in the design tool, I'm afraid that the solution is like very manual, where people do a lot of annotations next to the designs, and they point out to the component that the developer is supposed to use. They just plot lines and write down the names of the components, and you provide a link to ideally the documentation or a tool like Storybook if that's available. So a developer now, as I'm looking at the design, I know immediately that this thing's going to take me probably a couple of days to build because I have all the components I need. That's like really crucial information. So our way of approaching this at Zeplin has been like, how do we make this connection between design and code so we can sort of, designers don't have to do these annotations manually. So we have a bunch of features that around, there's one we call connected components, where you can actually map your components in design and components in code. So, and as you're looking at the design, it will give you the correct snippets to use, which is pretty powerful. And we've also built a Storybook integration right after that. So if you're using Storybook, you can directly connect the design components to the Storybook components as well. So there's a bunch of different ways of solving this, but I think the main sort of takeaway here is, as designers, we kind of need to provide the developers some sort of access to the documentation or the component. So it's not just up to them to figure out what components make up the design.
Yeah, there's an interesting analog of this in the manufacturing industry. I mean, anybody who has actually built like IKEA furniture has experienced this. The concept of a bill of materials. If you're doing a construction or manufacturing job, the bill of materials is like, here's all the stuff that's going to go into this. These boards, these brackets, these screws, whatever. Like this is everything you need before you start building. IKEA furniture, same thing. You open it up and it's like, dump out your bags, make sure all of your screws are in there. And that's essentially the same concept with how a design system should be applied when building a design, right? Okay, you're going to build the design, dump out your design system goodie bag and make sure everything's there, right? And everything looks like it's working before you get started. And then there's a question about whose responsibility that is, right? Is it the designer's responsibility to make sure everything's in place? Is it the developer's responsibility to go audit and make sure they're there? Or can this be automated in some way? Can a tool pick it up, right? Can some system take care of this for us? But I think that is absolutely a necessary part of a successful delivery system that uses a design system. And one of the other approaches I mentioned that we picked up on was the centralized design system team, where it's not kind of all designers contributing, but there is this ivory tower design system team who controls the design system, and you have to like appeal and petition to have your component approved or whatever, system is in place, go to the court of design systems. And then sometimes, it'll come back, no, we're not going to build that or fix that for you. So then the team building the design will go rogue and go build it themselves. And now you have fractured, splintered components and everybody's building their own versions of things. And so that can be difficult as well. But that's more about how your team chooses to manage the process of approving components and different things. I think as far as how you help the implementation team, the development team understand, it's very much what we're describing right here, right? At some point, they have to know this is the thing you have to build, and these are the pieces you're working with. And how you get that into their hands is kind of up to you. But there are tools like Zeplin that make that a little easier to do.
Yeah, I'm sure like whenever a developer is looking at the design that they need to build, the very first question is like, okay, I need to understand what components are in here and how many of these components I already have, because that is even going to like affect the development time, right? Because if you need to build a component from scratch, that's going to take longer. But if you have all the parts you need, it's going to be much easier. So it's this process of just like making that visibility like as best as we can, so you can immediately tell, right, I have everything I need.
Yeah. Cool. I do want to watch the clock here. I know we want to have some time
Yeah.
for Q&A, and I see some good questions coming in. Yeah, let's wrap up kind of what we see coming in the future, where design delivery goes, right? We've kind of covered the history of this a little bit, and where we came from, and how things have evolved. But I'm interested, especially in hearing from you, Berk, like what comes next? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. I've been thinking a lot about like how the space evolved. I feel like this is still such a new concept, just this idea of like delivery being much more than providing red lines and specs. So there's, I think, a wealth of things we can think about. One of the things I'm personally really excited about is how these will sort of connect to other sources of truth in the product team. Just to sort of walk you through an example, um, say a PM, the very first thing that they do is they create some sort of one page or PRD to like document the product work that needs to be done. And then what ends up happening is that you work on that first, which is a separate document somewhere, and then you go start working on the designs, which is great. And then these two sort of have to coexist, but that's always like really difficult. So we've been thinking a lot about like how do we incorporate that into this whole delivery workflow as well, just having this source of truth where everything is connected and you have access to everything you need. I mean, I can talk about this for hours, but I think the sort of main theme here is we need to make sure everything related to the product you're working on is sort of somehow connected to the designs, because that's what everyone goes and they want to look at first. I have this funny quote from a few PMs that I've talked to. Is they were like basically telling me, I write all these documents and no one actually reads them. They just like scroll down and show me the designs. I just want to look at the designs. So there's valuable information in there. So it's more like, how do we connect it all and make sure the whole team sort of gets what they need?
Yeah, I think you summarized there why design is better than PM. No, I'm just kidding. That like there's I'm 100% with you. Like I think as I've watched the tool space evolve, right? It was like, how can we redline, right? Like I'm manually writing red lines, and now we can automate red lines. And then redlining became aware of the design system, and now you can deliver designs where it's actually including components and tokens and kind of educating with links to documentation. And I think beyond that, like what are the other pieces that an implementation needs to know and understand to be successful? And I think that's like, where did this idea come from? What customer research validates this idea? Or where can I watch a clip of this customer mentioning this so that I care about it and I have deeper context as I'm implementing it? And how does this roll up to the greater mission and objectives of the business, and all of those pieces that are probably fragmented across some different documents, and slides or whatever, but how can the delivery actually be, here is all of the ideas and context that inform this design? And so I think having that central source of truth will be a great kind of step in the next direction, or in the future. And obviously we can't end a conversation without throwing AI in here somewhere, right? So at some point along the way, like I think a lot of this can be automated, right? We automated away redlining. Nobody redlines anymore. We are now automating away the need to annotate the design system elements, right? So now how can we automate the future of putting a lot of these pieces together and bringing that context together and centralizing information? I don't know. Smart people smarter than me will figure it out, probably Zeplin, but I do think there's a future there where there will be less manual work, right? And we can automate a lot of those pieces. And I'm excited to see where it goes. I certainly don't know where it will go, but I think it'll be exciting.
Yeah, I think there's a huge potential where we've talked about a lot of different pieces of the delivery process, and I completely agree. There's a bunch of potential for little automations that would just make this overall process feel less manual and less of a hassle.
Yeah. Looks like we've got our first question down here.
Yeah.
About the future of Zeplin. Do you want me to take that, Berk, or do you want to? No, just kidding.
Okay, let's read through this. As Figma rolls out demo, wondering what Zeplin's long-term vision is. Yeah, this is a question that I've got so many times in the past week. What's really interesting is that I think it kind of goes back to what we said in the beginning. I think there's a sort of core difference in the way we think about how this challenge should be solved compared to Figma. The way Figma's tackling this problem, I think naturally is built on top of the design tool. And even though it is called dev mode, it naturally lives in a design space, and they naturally need to think about like, how do we incorporate this into the infinite canvas? How do we make this work with the auto versioning system that we have? So I think the core difference is we are tackling the same challenges, but we're approaching in a totally different way, where sort of the core of Zeplin is that it's this environment where your designs move into, that we take a lot of inspiration from tools like Git, where it is much more structured, and it follows a lot of sort of the best practices rather than giving you just freedom to do whatever you want. So I think that's kind of the core difference between the way Figma and we approach this challenge, is that we want to make sure that there's a really structured sort of workflow that the whole team should follow. So we inherently provide a lot of native capabilities to these challenges. But in Figma, it's kind of naturally you have to sort of figure your own way. But I'm really glad that Figma's tackling, sort of acknowledging these challenges and starting to tackle these things as well.
I'm excited for
posted in the chat as well. It sees that there are a lot of these principles that we believe differentiates the way we look at this. You can sort of go read there. Looks like we have another question.
Next one here. How easy or difficult is it to maintain multiple Figma pages for different versions versus Zeplin commits? I'm going to let you take that one, Berk.
I guess it really depends. I guess if we assume that the way you're kind of doing this in Figma is you have this page where you keep all of your designs that are ready to be built. And then whenever a change is made, you duplicate the page and give it a name like v1.1. Obviously, the trick here is that you have to sort of make sure that you follow this pattern all the time, and you're not like missing stuff along the way. There's nothing in Figma that will let you that will stop you from editing an older version. It's all kind of up to you. Again, kind of going back to the previous question, we took a more structured approach where every change you make and then publish into Zeplin is logged. If you want to make another change, sure, you can go in and publish another version. And one of the key differences, I think, is also we think of versioning as per screen compared to Figma's versioning is just being file-wide. So in Zeplin, what you can do is you can just publish a version to an individual screen. You don't have to just do a versioning for the whole project. I think those are sort of the key differences.
How would Zeplin notify to others of a significant change to the UX which needs to be reviewed by, say, a technical designer? Okay, so this is coming back to that conversation we had about like notifying developers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so many Zeplin questions. The way we thought about this is, again, kind of lives in this change management versioning space, is as we were building this versioning system, a common thing that happened is like even though you publish and you're very intentional about your change, and everything is logged in Zeplin, you still want to go and tell people that you made a change, right? Because not everyone's going to be in Zeplin all the time. So the way we tackled this is there could be many different solutions, but it's usually through integrations like Slack and Teams. So whenever you make a change and you publish that change into Zeplin, since we keep that log, we are able to say, hey, Taylor made a change to this design, and just post that in Slack in a channel somewhere. So everyone just gets notified automatically. And you can even, as you're making these changes, you can even add commit messages. So you could tag people there and say, hey, I really want to get your eyes on this. This is kind of the way we've been thinking about it. Kind of a sneak peek to a feature that's coming up is also a feature we call approvals, name still TBD. But it's just this idea of like, as you publish designs into Zeplin, there are a lot of cases where just more people need to come in and just look at the designs and almost give it a thumbs up. So we're thinking of providing like a native feature for you to be able to do this.
Cool. Anna asks, are there more information on the design teams for the research, maturity, design team size? Yes, so I just dropped a link in the chat to where the full report lies on the UX Tools webpage. You can download the raw data if you want and dig into it as a spreadsheet and do your own queries and filters and stuff. We didn't ask about maturity or like years of experience, but hindsight is 2020. So if we ran this survey again, that's probably something we would ask, but you never quite know what to ask until you start digging into that first survey. But yeah, there's definitely more data to dig into, a lot more than we covered here. We only covered probably about, I don't know, 10 or 20% of kind of all the data. So feel free to dig in there if you're looking for more info. Brian asks, how as a design system team could we improve that ivory tower story? Most time design system teams are notoriously under-resourced, so no usually means we can't right now. How can we improve this pain point in delivery? What is the best approach in your opinion? Brian, if I knew the answer to this question, I would probably be a much richer man than I am right now, which is not a rich man. But I do think this is a common problem. And I think you're right. It does come down to a staffing and resourcing question. I knew a very smart designer who came up with a pretty interesting solution to this. And actually, he wrote a blog post I'll share here. I'll drop this in the chat as well. It is essentially, he uses this metaphor of the crust, the mantle, and the core, like of a planet, right? Core, mantle, crust, and how each of those rings is a different responsibility for a different team. So the core would be the design system team who needs to manage the most important, most crucial parts of the design system. And then as you move to the outer rings, teams that have maybe less essential, less foundational components actually manage them themselves. And they have a responsibility for some of the less used components that are needed for their specific features or their specific stories. And so you might find a way to democratize that or share that burden or do something that unblocks teams. But rest assured, this is not an easy problem to solve based on my experience. So best of luck to you. I'd love to hear if Berk has any ideas as well.
Yeah, maybe I can just share like what I've seen teams do, because I've kind of seen the both ends of the spectrum, where there's these massive enterprises where there's a set design system team that every single thing goes through. If you want to build a new component as a designer, you really can't. You have to like go through that ivory tower to make sure that it's well documented and everything. But obviously there are cons with that. It just kind of slows you down. You kind of lose that nimbleness. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you could have a design system that's just maintained by a few designers and developers, and then just anyone can come in and contribute. But obviously, you can guess there's downsides to that as well. So I don't think there's just one solution. You kind of have to find your spot in that spectrum and just go with whatever sort of fits your team culture, I guess.
That was fantastic. I think a wonderful way to wrap us both up. So before we leave, I just wanted to again throw all of our links there too. If you have a question that was not answered, please feel free to reach out to us, join our Discord, catch up with Berk and catch up with Taylor on their socials too. Let's give a last round of emoji love to Taylor and Berk for such an amazing chat. Thank you again so much for your wisdom and for talking about the survey. So again, too, for more data, we've linked the survey, the actual report data there too in the chat. But again, thank you so much for everybody who joined us, and I hope you all have a great rest of your Tuesday.